You ever smell something so wrong it stops you mid-step? That's what hit me first. The paint, thick and chemical, baking under a Texas morning that hadn't even reached 80 yet, mixing with the sweet, almost burnt sugar scent of honey that should have meant everything was fine. But it wasn't, because the sound came next, and I've lived with bees long enough to know the difference between a calm hive and panic. And this was chaos. Wings slamming against wood like rain on a metal roof. Frantic, disoriented, wrong. I dropped my coffee somewhere in the grass and walked faster, gravel crunching under my boots, heart already ahead of me like it knew what I was about to see. And then I turned the corner of my shed and there they were, my beehives, all 6 of them, lined up like they always were, except now they were streaked in harsh white spray paint, thick lines dripping down the cedar boxes, soaking into the grain I'd sanded myself, and across the top of the middle hive, in big uneven letters, one word. Ugly. I just stood there for a second, not moving, not breathing right, because it wasn't just paint, it was fresh, still wet in spots, still off-gassing that sharp smell that cuts into your throat, and bees were crawling over it, confused, slipping, trying to find their way back to an entrance that didn't smell like home anymore. I reached out, but stopped myself inches from the surface because I knew better. Touching it wouldn't fix it. Rushing wouldn't fix it. Nothing impulsive ever fixes something like this. Then I heard the click of a gate behind me, slow, deliberate, like someone making sure I knew they were there, and I didn't have to turn around to know who it was, because in this neighborhood, only one person moves like that when they think they've just proven a point. Brenda Holloway, HOA president, self-appointed guardian of property values, standing just on the other side of my fence like she was inspecting a job well done. I finally turned, and there she was in her pressed linen shirt, sunglasses too big for her face, lips tight like she'd been waiting for this exact moment, and she tilted her head just enough to take in the hives, and then me, like she expected me to react, to snap, to give her something she could use. But I didn't say anything, not yet, because my ears were still full of that sound, the hives rattling, the bees hitting the inside walls, trying to navigate a scent that had been overwritten by cheap paint. You have to understand, bees don't just live in those boxes, they map them, memorize them, every inch by smell, by temperature, by subtle cues we don't even notice, and now all of that was scrambled, replaced with something artificial and aggressive, something that told them they weren't home anymore. I stepped closer, slow, careful, watching how they clustered at the entrance, hesitating, circling, like they didn't trust what they were seeing, and that's when I felt it. Not anger, not yet, but something colder, something steadier, the kind of clarity that only shows up when you realize someone didn't just cross a line. They planned to erase it. Brenda shifted her weight and said something about community standards and visual compliance, her voice light, almost casual, like she was talking about trimming hedges instead of interfering with a working apiary. And I let her words pass right through me, because what she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that those bees weren't just a hobby, they were the reason I still had this place. The reason I paid my bills after everything went sideways a couple years back. The reason half the yards on this block bloomed the way they did every spring. I glanced past her, toward her backyard, where her prize roses sat in perfect rows, buds just starting to open, all of it depending on the same quiet system she had just decided to mess with. I looked back at the paint, at the words she'd chosen, at the way it bled into the wood like it belonged there, and I finally nodded once, more to myself than to her, because in that moment I understood something simple and unchangeable. This wasn't going to be solved by arguing across a fence. This was going to take time, patience, and the kind of response that doesn't shout, doesn't rush, doesn't miss. I turned away from her without another word, pulled my phone from my pocket, and started recording. The sound of the hives filling the mic, the paint gleaming under the sun, every detail exactly as it was, because if Brenda thought this ended with a can of spray paint, she had no idea. What she'd actually started, I did not touch the hives right away. And that was the hardest part, because every instinct in me said fix it now, wipe it down, scrape the paint, do something, but bees do not respond well to panic and neither do situations like this. So I stood there a few more seconds, letting my breathing match the rhythm of the yard, slow, steady, grounded, while the sound from the boxes stayed sharp and restless. Then I moved with intention, not speed, walking back to the shed. Grabbing my spare camera kit, the one I used when I checked hive health, and I mounted it low on the post facing the row, angling it just right so every box, every mark of paint, every movement would be documented in clean, undeniable detail. I said nothing to Brenda, even when I felt her eyes on my back, even when she shifted like she was waiting for me to argue, because people like her do not win arguments with facts. They win when you lose control, and I was not going to give her that. By the time I turned around again, she was already halfway back toward her patio, satisfied, like she had just corrected something out of place, and that image stuck with me more than the paint did, the quiet certainty in her posture that she could step into someone else's space and redefine it without consequence. I lifted the lid on the first hive just an inch, enough to let a little air move through, careful not to disrupt the cluster, and the smell hit again, heavier this time, the solvent, mixing with heat trapped inside the wood, and I saw the bees struggling to orient, crawling in small circles, hesitating at the edges like the world had shifted half an inch out of alignment. I lowered the lid gently and stepped back, because forcing them would only make it worse, and that was the moment the calculation started, not emotional, not reactive, just a clear line forming in my head from cause to effect. I pulled out my phone again and called the county agricultural office, the number I had saved months ago when I first registered the hives, and when the technician answered, I kept my voice even. Described the situation exactly as it was, fresh paint applied to active beehives, potential contamination, behavioral disruption, and I asked for an official inspection. He paused for half a second, then said he would be out within 48 hours, maybe sooner given the conditions, and I thanked him, ended the call, and immediately started a second list in my notes: time of incident, temperature, hive activity, visible markings, everything precise, everything something that could not be argued away later. I walked the perimeter next, checking the fence line, the latch, the ground, where the overspray had drifted, taking photos from multiple angles, close and wide, making sure the position of each hive relative to the property line was clear, because I already knew where this would go. I knew she would say she was enforcing guidelines, that she was protecting aesthetics, that she had the authority, and I also knew that authority does not extend to damaging active agricultural equipment, especially not when it affects more than just one yard. As I worked, the neighborhood started to wake up, garage doors humming open, sprinklers clicking on in neat arcs, and I watched the water hit the flower beds across the street, watched it beat on petals that would not last long without pollination, and that thought settled in quietly, not as revenge, not yet, but as a simple, unavoidable truth. I glanced again toward Brenda's yard, the rows of roses she bragged about at every meeting, the small citrus trees she had planted last season, all of it dependent on something she had just tried to control without understanding. I finished documenting and finally let myself stand still again in front of the hives, the noise still uneven but already shifting, the bees adjusting in small ways, trying to rewrite their map around the interference, and I nodded once, because that is what they do. They adapt, they find a way, and I was going to do the same. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to knock on her door, because this was already bigger than a disagreement. This was a chain reaction, and once it started, it was not something she could paint over or explain away. It was something that would unfold on its own timeline, steady, patient, and impossible to ignore. People think bees are simple, like they just fly and make honey, but they remember everything. That is what I heard my old mentor say years ago, and standing there that morning, watching them hesitate at the hive entrances, I finally understood what he meant in a way that felt personal. Because this was not just disruption. This was confusion layered over instinct, and I could see it in the way they moved, short loops instead of clean lines, landing and lifting again like they did not trust the ground beneath them. I crouched down a few feet away, keeping my movements slow, steady, letting the sound settle into something I could read, and I started to pick out patterns, which hives were recovering faster, which ones were still disoriented, how the sunlight hit the painted surfaces and amplified the heat, turning those boxes into something unfamiliar to the colony inside. I pulled out my notebook, the same one I used for every inspection, and began writing everything down, not just for the report, but for myself. Because when you deal with living systems, details matter more than emotions, and right now, the details were telling a story that had not finished unfolding yet. The temperature was climbing past 85 degrees, and the paint was holding that heat, changing the microclimate inside the hive, pushing the bees to work harder just to regulate what should have been stable, and that meant energy lost, focus lost, and over time, productivity lost, and I knew exactly where that line led. I walked to the edge of my yard and looked out across the neighborhood again, not as a homeowner, but as someone tracking a system, following invisible connections, and I could already map it out in my head, the way my hives fed into the gardens around me, the way pollination moved from yard to yard without anyone noticing until it stopped. Brenda's property sat right in the center of that pattern, her flower beds arranged in neat, deliberate rows, her citrus trees just beginning to set early fruit. All of it depending on consistent visits from the same bees she had just thrown into confusion. I did not smile, I did not react, but I let that realization settle in like a quiet equation solving itself. Then my phone buzzed, and I saw a notification from the HOA email list, a message from Brenda sent just minutes earlier, subject line in all caps about maintaining visual standards and ensuring compliance for upcoming neighborhood evaluations, and I opened it, reading her words carefully. The way she framed it as improvement, as responsibility, as something done for the greater good, and I almost had to respect the timing, because she had already started building her version of the story before anyone else even knew there was one. I took a screenshot, saved it, added it to the growing file in my phone, because narratives matter just as much as evidence, and she had just given me both in one move. I went back to the hives and set up a second camera, this one tighter, focused on the entrances, capturing the bees as they adjusted, as they relearned, because I knew this was not just about a single moment. This was about change over time, and time was something I was willing to give. By early afternoon, the sound had shifted again, less frantic, more structured, still strained but stabilizing, and that told me something important. They were adapting, they were compensating, and that meant the system was still alive, still functioning, just under pressure. I stood there with the sun high overhead, heat pressing down on the painted wood, and I let my eyes move once more toward Brenda's yard, where she was now watering her plants, moving methodically from one row to the next, completely unaware of the chain reaction already in motion, and I realized then that I did not need to create anything new. I did not need to force a result, because everything that needed to happen had already been set in place. All I had to do was document it, protect what was mine, and let the outcome follow the same rules it always had, steady, patient, and impossible to stop once it began. The problem with control is that it only works when everything stays predictable, and by late afternoon, nothing about this situation was predictable anymore, not for the bees, and definitely not for what was coming next. I stayed outside longer than usual, moving between the hives in slow, deliberate passes, watching how each colony adjusted to the altered conditions, how some found new entry paths quicker while others hesitated longer, and I logged every difference, every shift, because patterns were forming and I needed them clear, undeniable, and tied to a timeline that could not be argued away later. The sun pushed past 90 degrees, and the painted surfaces started radiating heat in a way untreated would, and I could feel it even standing a few feet away, that unnatural warmth rising off the boxes, forcing the bees to fan harder at the entrances, wings moving in tight, synchronized waves just to keep the interior stable, and that meant they were burning energy they should have been using to forage, to build, to sustain the cycle that kept everything around here alive. I stepped back and wiped my hands on my jeans. Not because they were dirty, but because I needed to ground myself in something simple, something real, while everything else shifted into place. My phone buzzed again, this time a neighbor, Mark from 2 houses down, asking if everything was all right, because his wife noticed fewer bees in their backyard that morning, and I read the message twice before replying, keeping it neutral, telling him I was monitoring a situation and would update if needed, because it was not time yet to explain, not time yet to connect the dots out loud. Across the fence, Brenda was still outside, moving between her flower beds with a hose in hand, the water catching sunlight in small arcs, droplets landing on petals that looked perfect from a distance, untouched, controlled, exactly how she wanted everything to appear, and I watched that scene for a moment, not with frustration, but with a kind of detached clarity, because appearances have a short shelf life when they depend on systems you do not. Understand. I walked back to the shed and pulled out a small infrared thermometer, the same one I used during peak summer checks, and I aimed it at the side of one of the painted hives, watching the numbers climb higher than they should, confirming what I already felt in the air. Then I aimed it at an unpainted section near the base, comparing, documenting, making sure every piece of data had context, had contrast, had weight. I recorded a short video, narrating quietly, explaining the difference in surface temperature, the behavioral changes at the entrance, the potential impact over time, not for an audience, not yet, but for the record, for the moment when facts would need to speak louder than opinions. As the light began to soften and the edge of the day crept in, the sound from the hives steadied further, still strained, but no longer chaotic. And that told me the colonies were stabilizing under pressure, adapting to something they should never have had to adapt to in the first place. And there was something almost unsettling about that resilience, because it meant the real consequences were not immediate. They were delayed, subtle, spreading outward instead of exploding all at once. I leaned against the fence post for a second and let the quiet settle in, the kind of quiet that only shows up right before something larger reveals itself. And I thought about the HOA meeting scheduled for the weekend, the one Brenda had been pushing for weeks, centered around curb appeal and community standards, and I could already see how she planned to use it, how she would frame this as enforcement, as leadership, as necessary action. And I also saw how incomplete that picture was, how much of it depended on people not looking too closely, not asking the right questions. I checked the camera feeds one more time, both angles clear, both capturing everything as it unfolded, and I saved backups to a separate drive inside the house, making sure nothing could be lost, nothing could be dismissed. When I stepped back outside, the sky had shifted into that deep orange that comes just before sunset, casting long shadows across the yard, and the painted hives looked almost calm from a distance, like nothing had happened, like everything was in order, and that contrast stayed with me, because it mirrored exactly what Brenda believed she had accomplished. I took one last look toward her yard, where she was now standing back, hands on her hips, surveying her work like it was complete, like the outcome was already decided, and I felt that same steady clarity settle deeper this time, because she was not seeing what I was seeing. She was not tracking the changes, the connections, the timing, and that gap between what she thought was finished and what had actually begun was where everything else was going to unfold, slowly, precisely, and entirely on its own terms. The next morning is when the system starts telling the truth, and I could hear it before I even opened the back door. That subtle difference in the air, not silence, not absence, just less, like something had been turned down a notch you would not notice unless you were used to it. I stepped outside with my coffee still hot in my hand, the sun barely over the rooftops, and I walked straight to the hives, not rushing, just steady, because I already knew I was not looking for damage anymore. I was looking for change. The bees were active. That part was clear, but their flight paths were tighter, more localized, fewer long arcs stretching out toward the neighboring yards. And I watched for a full minute without moving, tracking individual lines, seeing how many returned with pollen, how many hesitated at the entrance, and the ratio was off, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough that I felt it settle into place as confirmation. I set my mug down on the fence post and pulled up the camera feed from overnight, scrolling through the timestamps, watching how activity dipped during the hottest hours and recovered slower than it should have. And I marked each segment, building a timeline that now extended beyond a single incident into a measurable pattern. Then my phone buzzed again, another message, this time from Lisa across the street, asking if I had seen fewer bees around her vegetable beds because her squash flowers were opening but not setting the way they usually did. And I read it carefully, then typed back the same kind of measured response, telling her I was monitoring something and would keep her posted, because it still was not time to connect everything out loud, not until the picture was complete. I walked the perimeter again, slower this time, letting my eyes move beyond my own yard, and I noticed small things, petals that looked untouched longer than they should, a lack of that usual flicker of movement above the flower lines. And it was subtle, almost easy to dismiss. But once you see a pattern, you cannot unsee it. Across the fence, Brenda was already outside, kneeling by her rose beds with a pair of pruning shears, trimming edges with that same controlled precision she applied to everything else, and from a distance, It all still looked perfect. The symmetry, the color, the structure, but I watched a little longer and saw the difference. Fewer bees moving through the blooms, longer pauses between visits, and I knew she was not seeing it yet because she was focused on shape, not function. I picked up my infrared thermometer again and checked the hives, comparing temperatures to the previous day, noting slight improvements as the bees adjusted, but still elevated where the paint covered the wood, still forcing them to work harder than necessary. And I recorded another short clip, narrating the changes, the gradual stabilization paired with reduced outward activity, because both sides of that equation mattered. As the morning moved forward, I sat at the small table, near the shed with my notebook open, transferring everything into a cleaner format: times, observations, messages from neighbors, environmental conditions, building a record that did not rely on memory or interpretation, just facts stacked in sequence. I paused for a second and looked up again, letting my gaze travel across the block, and it hit me then how quiet the whole thing was, how no one was raising alarms, no one was making a scene, and yet something fundamental was shifting under the surface, something that would not stay hidden for long. My phone chimed again, this time the county technician confirming his visit for later that afternoon, and I read the message twice, then saved it, because timing was lining up in a way that felt almost precise, like each piece was arriving exactly when it needed to. I closed the notebook, stood up, and walked back toward the hives one more time, watching the entrances, listening to the hum that had steadied but not fully recovered, and I let that sound settle into me, because it was the baseline now, the new normal after interference, and I knew from experience that systems like this do not snap back instantly. They adjust, they compensate, and the consequences of that adjustment ripple outward in ways that are not always obvious at first. I turned slightly and looked toward Brenda's yard again, where she had now stepped back from her roses, hands on her hips, scanning for imperfections she could correct, completely unaware that the variables she could not see were already in motion, already affecting the very thing she was trying to perfect. And I felt that same steady clarity return, stronger this time, because I did not need to confront her. I did not need to argue. I just needed to let the timeline continue, let the evidence build, and let the system she had interfered with respond the only way. It knew how, gradually, quietly, and with a precision that no amount of control could override. You can tell when consequences stop being theoretical. And it happened that afternoon when the county truck rolled up slow along the curb, tires crunching over gravel like it had done this 100 times before. Calm, procedural, not dramatic. And that was exactly what made it powerful. I was already outside when the technician stepped out, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning before he even reached the gate, and I walked him through without embellishment, just facts, just sequence, just what had been done and what had followed. He crouched near the first hive, not touching, just observing, watching the movement at the entrance, the altered behavior, the residue of paint still visible along the grain, and he nodded once like he had seen enough to understand the direction this was going. I handed him my notes, the timestamps, the temperature readings, the messages from neighbors, and he flipped through them slowly, methodically, asking a few precise questions about timing, about materials, about changes in activity, and I answered each one the same way, steady, consistent, nothing added, nothing exaggerated. Then he stepped back and took his own readings, surface temperature, ambient conditions, documenting in his own system, independent, objective. And I watched that process carefully because this was the shift. This was where it moved from my word to recorded fact, across the fence. Brenda appeared again, drawn by the presence of the truck, and she walked closer with that same controlled posture, asking what was going on, her tone light, but edged with something tighter underneath, and the technician answered her without looking up from his notes, explaining the inspection, the reported interference, the need to assess impact, and I saw the first flicker of uncertainty cross her face, quick, almost hidden, but there. She started to explain her side, something about guidelines and visual standards, but he did not engage in that direction. He stayed on scope, on impact, on evidence, and that was the difference, because this was no longer about preference, it was about measurable effect. I stepped back a few feet, giving space, letting the process run without interruption, and I could feel the balance shifting, not loudly, not dramatically, just a gradual tilt as information replaced assumption. The technician finished his initial assessment and told me he would file a formal report, that there were clear indicators of disruption tied to the applied substance, that further evaluation might be required depending on recovery patterns, and I nodded, thanked him, and watched as he documented the final photos, each angle precise, each detail captured in a way that could not be rewritten later. Brenda stood there longer than usual after that, arms folded now, watching as the technician packed up, and I could tell she was recalculating, trying to fit this into the narrative she had already built. But there was a gap now, something she could not smooth over with wording or authority. When the truck pulled away, the street returned to its quiet rhythm, but it felt different, like a line had been drawn that could not be erased. I walked back to the hives and stood there again, listening. The sound steady but still working, still adjusting. And I let that settle into me, because this was not the end. It was the confirmation, the point where everything that followed would be anchored in something solid. My phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from Mark saying his trees were not attracting as many bees that afternoon, and I read it, then saved it, adding it to the chain, because each piece mattered, each observation built weight. I looked once more toward Brenda's yard, where she had returned to her flowers, moving a little faster now, a little less certain, and I realized something simple and exact. She thought control meant acting first, but control actually belongs to whoever understands what happens next. And as I stood there with the hum of the hive steady in my ears, I knew exactly what was coming, not because I was forcing it, but because the system she interrupted was already responding in ways she could not stop, only witness as it unfolded step by step, day by day, until the outcome spoke for itself. Day 3 is when denial starts to crack, and it did not happen with a loud moment or some dramatic collapse. It showed up in small, undeniable gaps, the kind you only notice when you have been watching closely from the beginning. I was out early again, same routine, same path from the back door to the hives, coffee in hand, air still cool enough to carry sound clean, and the hum I heard was stronger than yesterday, more organized, the colonies continuing to stabilize, doing exactly what they are built to do, adapt, recover, keep going. But the difference was not here anymore, not in my yard, it was out there. I stepped past the fence line and let my eyes move across the block, slower this time, more deliberate, and it did not take long to see it. The movement above the flower beds was thinner, not empty, just reduced, like a frequency dropping lower than it should be. And once you see that shift, it stands out everywhere. I walked along the sidewalk, casual, not drawing attention, just observing, and I passed Mark's place first, his trees usually buzzing this time of morning. But now there were long pauses between visits, blossoms open and waiting, and he was already outside, hands on his hips, scanning the branches like he was trying to figure out what fell off. And when he saw me, he gave a small nod and said it had been slower since yesterday, not dead, just not right. And I nodded back, keeping my voice even, telling him I was still tracking something and would update soon, because the pattern needed one more day to lock in completely. I kept walking, past Lisa's vegetable beds, where the squash flowers sat wide open, bright and ready, but untouched longer than they should be, and she was there too, crouched low, brushing a leaf aside, looking closer like she expected to find an answer on the surface, and I saw the same thing in her expression that I had felt earlier, that quiet confusion when something simple stops working the way it always has. I turned back toward my yard, and that is when I saw Brenda, already in her garden again, but different this time, not slow and controlled, not measured. She was moving faster, checking each row, stepping back, stepping in again, like she was trying to correct something that would not respond to trimming or watering. I leaned lightly against the fence post and watched without saying a word, because this was the moment where the system stopped being invisible to her, where the gap between what she expected and what was happening became too wide to ignore. She knelt by her roses, touching the blooms, adjusting the soil, reaching for the hose again, even though the ground was already damp, and I could see it in the way she moved, the slight hesitation, the repeated checks, the lack of that earlier certainty, and it confirmed everything I had been building toward since the first morning. I pulled out my phone and opened the camera feeds, scrolling through the past 48 hours, watching the hive stabilize while the outward activity remained lower than baseline. And I overlaid that with the messages from neighbors, the observations, the technicians' notes, and the picture was complete now. Not just a single cause, not just a single effect, but a chain, clear, timed, and impossible to separate. My phone buzzed again. Another message on the HOA thread this time. Someone asking if anyone else was seeing fewer pollinators. Another reply mentioning poor fruit set. Another asking if it was weather-related, and I read through it slowly, watching the conversation form in real time, the same way everything else had, gradually, piece by piece, until it could not be dismissed. I locked my phone and looked back at Brenda's yard, where she had now stepped back again, hands on her hips like before, but the posture was different, tighter, less confident, and I realized this was the exact point where control shifts, not with confrontation, not with force, but with awareness, when the reality of a system starts to override the story someone tried to impose on it. I turned slightly and listened to the hives behind me, the hum steady now, resilient, doing their part despite everything. And I let that sound anchor the moment, because everything that needed to happen was already happening, not loudly, not dramatically, just steadily. And for the first time since this started, I knew she could see it too, even if she did not understand it yet. And that was enough, because understanding always comes next, whether you want it to or not. The moment people stop guessing and start comparing notes is when everything changes, and it happened that evening, right as the sun dipped low and the neighborhood gathered for what was supposed to be a simple HOA walkthrough, the same one Brenda had been pushing for weeks, the one centered around presentation, consistency, control. I stood near the edge of my yard as small groups formed along the sidewalk, neighbors talking in low voices, phones in hand, showing each other pictures of flowers that had opened but not set, trees that looked healthy but were not progressing the way they should. And I watched the pattern move from isolated confusion to shared awareness, the exact shift I had been waiting for. Brenda moved through the crowd with that same practiced smile, greeting people, gesturing toward her garden like it was the standard everyone should follow. But the timing was off now, the energy around her different, because people were no longer just looking. They were noticing, comparing, asking questions she did not have clean answers for. I stayed quiet, letting the conversation build on its own, because this was not something I needed to push. It was already unfolding. And when enough small inconsistencies line up, they become impossible to ignore. Someone mentioned fewer bees. Someone else brought up poor pollination. Another added that it started just a couple of days ago. And I could see the moment the timeline began to align in people's heads, the same way it had in mine. Cause and effect moving closer together until they almost touched. Brenda tried to redirect, talking about watering schedules, soil quality, seasonal variation, but the explanations did not land the same way anymore, not with multiple people seeing the same shift at the same time. I stepped forward just enough to be part of the circle and said nothing at first, just listened, because silence at the right moment carries more weight than interruption. And when the pause came, when the conversation stalled on uncertainty, I simply pulled out my phone and opened the footage, not announcing it, just holding it where it could be seen. The video played without commentary, the early morning light, the row of hives, the movement at the fence, the spray paint marking each box, the timing clear, the action undeniable, and I watched the reflection of that screen in the faces around me. The way understanding replaced assumption one person at a time. No one raised their voice, no one needed to, because the evidence spoke in a way that did not require emphasis. It just existed, complete and precise. I followed it with the technician's report, the temperature readings, the documented behavioral changes, laying each piece out in sequence, not as an accusation, not as an argument, just as a record, and that distinction mattered, because it left no room for interpretation, only acknowledgement. Brenda's expression shifted again, the practiced confidence giving way to something tighter, something that looked like she was trying to regain control of a situation that had already moved past her. She started to speak, to explain, to frame it as enforcement, but the words did not hold the same weight against what people had just seen and what they were already experiencing in their own yards. I stepped back after that, returning to the edge of the group. Because the conversation no longer needed me. It had its own momentum now, neighbors asking questions, connecting details, looking from the screen to the surrounding gardens and back again, and I could feel the balance settle into place. Not with force, not with confrontation, but with clarity. I glanced toward Brenda's garden one more time. The roses still standing, still arranged perfectly, but now framed by a different context. One that included everything else that was no longer working the way it should. And I understood that this was the real turning point. Not the moment the paint was applied, not even the inspection, but this, when the system became visible to everyone at once. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and listened as the conversation continued without me. The hum of voices replacing the hum of the hives for just a moment, and I knew that whatever came next was no longer about proving anything. It was about what people had already seen, already felt, already connected. And once that kind of understanding takes hold, it does not fade. It settles in, steady and permanent. Just like everything else that had been set in motion from the very beginning, justice does not arrive all at once. It settles in piece by piece until there is no room left for anything else. And by the next morning, that is exactly what it felt like. Not loud, not chaotic, just final in a way that could not be undone. The neighborhood was quieter, but not in a normal way. It was the kind of quiet that follows understanding, when people have already made up their minds without needing to say it out loud. I stepped outside early again. Same routine, same path. But this time the air felt different, lighter somehow. And when I reached the hives, the sound told me everything before I even looked closely. Steady, balanced, the kind of hum that means the system has corrected itself as much as it can under the circumstances. I watched the bees move, longer flight paths returning, more consistent entries, the rhythm coming back piece by piece, and I let that settle in because this was the part that mattered most to me. Not the meeting, not the conversation, but this quiet recovery that proved the core was still intact. My phone buzzed with notifications, the HOA thread active again, but the tone had shifted completely. No more speculation, no more guessing, just direct questions about what had happened, about responsibility, about next steps, and I read through them slowly, not responding yet, because I did not need to add anything more. The record was already complete. Across the fence, Brenda's yard looked different even though nothing physical had changed overnight. The rows still aligned, the colors still there, but the absence was visible now, the reduced movement above the flowers, the slower progress, and more than that, the way she stood in it, not with control, but with uncertainty, scanning, adjusting, stepping back and then forward again like she was trying to find a version of the outcome that no longer existed. A car pulled up mid-morning. Another HOA board member stepping out, clipboard in hand this time. Not for inspection of aesthetics, but for review, and I stayed where I was, near the hives, giving space, because this part did not require my presence. It required the same thing everything else had: facts, sequence, clarity. I could hear pieces of the conversation from across the yard, measured voices, questions that had direct answers, references to the report, to the footage, to the impact across multiple properties, and there was no argument in it, no raised tones, just a process moving forward exactly as it should when all variables are visible. I turned back to the hives and rested my hand lightly on the side of one box, feeling the warmth, natural this time, not trapped, not altered, just part of the normal cycle. And I closed my eyes for a second, letting the sound settle fully, because this was the payoff that mattered, not something taken from someone else, but something restored to where it belonged. When I opened my eyes again, I saw Brenda walking back toward her house, slower now, shoulders tighter, the certainty gone, replaced by something quieter, something that looked like realization arriving a step at a time. And I understood that this was the moment she finally saw the full chain, not just the action, but everything that followed it, everything she could not control once it started. I picked up my notebook from the table and flipped to the first page, the initial entry, the time, the temperature, the first observation, and I traced the line forward in my mind through every detail that came after, each piece connecting to the next until it formed something complete. Something that did not rely on opinion or authority, only on cause and effect. I closed the notebook and set it down, then looked out across the neighborhood one more time, watching as small signs of recovery began to appear, a few more bees in the air, a little more movement where there had been less. The system correcting itself the way it always does when given the chance. I did not need to say anything. I did not need to prove anything else. because everything that needed to be understood had already been seen, already been felt, and as I stood there with the steady hum filling the space around me, one simple truth settled in completely, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be real, that control without understanding always collapses, and when it does, it is not loud, it is not dramatic, it is quiet, precise, and impossible to reverse once it reaches its end.